Okay, thank you, Jack.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first of three webinars that Philanthropy Australia is doing in conjunction with AIDN. I'm Jack Heath, I'm the CEO of Philanthropy Australia, and it's my great honour to welcome everyone who's participating today. I would like to commence with acknowledgement of country. Philanthropy Australia acknowledges and pays respects to the past, present, and emerging traditional custodians and elders of the lands upon which we work. We also accept the invitation in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to walk together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. I'm also coming to you from Gadigal land here in Sydney. Pay my respects to any Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us on this call today, and invite people, if you'd like, to indicate in the chat session what country that you're coming from. I just wanted to say a few words. As I mentioned, this is the first of three webinars that are going to be done in conjunction with AIDN. In terms of Philanthropy Australia, our purpose is about how do we inspire more and better philanthropy. In terms of the more piece, we're looking to double structured philanthropic giving from 2.5 billion that it was this year to around about 5 billion by the year 2030. And the second component of that is around better philanthropy. And from what you'll be hearing today, it's going to be giving more of the details and information about what better philanthropy looks like. I think one of the things that's really important in this day and age is that with Zoom and with crises that we've had in our local communities, we've become very tribal, and we've tended to, sort of draw back to our own little individual community. And I think at this time, the ability for us to reach out to that wider humanity is absolutely critical. And, when we look at the word philanthropy, it means love of humanity. And so it's really important that we look beyond our immediate shores, notwithstanding all the challenges that we're facing here in Australia at the moment, because, the love of a child that a mother has, in the ravages of, Lismore is the same love that, a mother in Kiev has, or fleeing Kiev has, or a mother that's in Dar es Salaam or somewhere in East Africa. And so I think this common humanity is something that is just so fundamental, and sometimes we can lose sight of that. And so that's one of the reasons why we're super pleased to be working with AIDN and the team in terms of these webinars. Your host today is going to be Mark Cubit, will be known to many of you. I think what's really interesting about Mark's story is that, he stepped out of the for-profit world as a managing director of equities at Merrill Lynch. This is back in 2003. He got involved volunteering, serves on various boards, and then set up his family foundation with his wife, Amanda, and also has been helping others, including the Wheelers, in terms of the establishment of the Planet Wheeler Foundation. So quite an eminent philanthropist in Australia, and so thrilled to be partnering with you, Mark, and I'll pass over to you now to lead us through today's discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jack, and let me add my welcome to everyone to this, the first of our three-part series titled The Compelling Case for Global Giving. Firstly, some housekeeping. The session is being recorded and will be shown on various platforms, including AIDN and Philanthropy Australia's websites. Could I please ask you to write your full name on your Zoom thumbnail if it's not there already? If your kids were last on Zoom, who knows what could be there. And please stay on mute unless you're invited to speak or if you're asking a question. Today, we will have the chat function operating, and we hope to have time for Q&A before the end of our 60 minutes. So why are we all here today? Well, there's a significant and growing bunch of us who are funders of causes internationally. For some of us, we live and breathe it every day of our working week, and sometimes on the weekends as well. Before COVID impacted our lives, we each spend 4, 6, sometimes even 8 weeks of the year on the back roads of Cambodia, mountain paths of Nepal, or walking through rice paddies in Madagascar, visiting people doing amazing, impactful things, going back year after year and seeing constant improvement. we wanted to share our experiences with others in the Australian philanthropic community, and we're grateful to Philanthropy Australia for giving us this platform. More than 10 cents in every charitable dollar in our country goes to assisting those offshore. But like we've come to realise with the pandemic, the wicked social and environmental problems we face are increasingly regional and global in nature. By addressing and funding the remedies to these problems in a predominantly domestic-only setting, do we as funders risk treating the symptoms and not the cause of a growing proportion of these problems? Problems which have often not originated domestically, be it COVID-19, climate change, or even our treatment of refugees. So today and over the next two sessions, we're making the case for why Australian donors need to be more involved in international giving. And with an audience of over 100, and in most cases, we tend to see double that number watching the replay off the YouTube channel in subsequent months. There's no doubt offshore is where some of the biggest challenges still lie, but also where most of the impact can be achieved with minimal dollars. In our conversation today, and over these three sessions, our aim is to leave you with the knowledge about how you can overcome some of the barriers to international giving. We'll answer what we see as some of the key questions. Why global? How do I start? How do I know if my money gets there? How do I know if it'll be spent prudently? Who can I trust? And I need tax deductibility. Is that available? So to start off, let's look at where international philanthropy sits in the overall Australian context. And you could do no better than talk to John McLeod of JB Were Philanthropic Services. John's bio is available in the chat function. John, thanks for joining us today.
No problem, Mark. Happy to be here.
John, let's set the scene here. Within the context of the broader philanthropic sector in Australia, how big is international philanthropy?
It's a good question. I might try and get Emily to share a slide if that's possible. What this slide shows, it's for those who know me and my desire to, can anyone see? Oh, there it is. Beautiful. That's a picture of philanthropy in Australia and by the recipients. So you can see in the grey area on there, international aid, international activities. So it's the third largest of the cause areas. And like most countries, religion's the largest one, but it's steadily falling in most countries, and you only need to look at census and who ticks what in census to get a good pattern of that. But it's still 20% of total giving. International aid is about 12% of the total. Varies a little bit from year to year, but around 12%, and that's worth about $1.2 billion. So it's always good to know how large it is, and we'll look at it later on compared to international, but it's also worth remembering all the other different causes there that people support. So that there is a lot of competition there, but yeah, about 12%, 1.2 billion.
John, is it fair to say some of the religious activities funding could also go internationally?
Some does. The definition of the blue area there is basic religious charities. So it is sort of money on the plate on Sundays, but undoubtedly a little bit of that does go. So, you know, Project Compassion and things like that. I remember building the little boxes and putting pennies into them when I was a kid, and it was pennies, I think, back then. Look, there is a trickle there, but they do separate them. So religious organisations that do international aid, such as World Vision, Save the Children, etc., they're in the grey area, not the blue.
Gotcha. Okay. And John, what trends are you seeing out there? Growth, decline? What's the current picture?
Yeah, look, I'll flick over to the next chart there because a lot of the perfect data isn't very timely. And the NAB, who owns JB Were, do or give us the data to do a charitable giving index. So we look at monthly transactions that go to charities in Australia, and we can break that up into all different cause areas. So I think that the first thing to note is very recently we've had this thing called COVID, and it had a dramatic effect on giving in Australia. So from Feb 2020, when we were at the end of the bushfires, and we did see that good gentle rise there to environment and animals, we saw a calamitous fall in giving, and it was all because events couldn't happen, and so there wasn't the ability until we got that change in charities and how they approach donors. International aid didn't fall anywhere near as much as that, so it wasn't as reliant on events. It was reliant on direct giving, credit card, sponsor a child type of things, and so its fall wasn't as dramatic as the overall sector. So it held up pretty well during that. Overall, some longer term trends for them. Since 2014, when the ACNC started collecting data, donations to international aid are up 71%. That's against the broad charity sector donations, which are only up 60%. So it has increased in its share over that time, which is good, and it is a large cause, and didn't quite suffer as much during that downturn. There's some longer term other issues, I think, though, that are worth talking about when we get to that.
And John, how do we compare with other countries, be it US, UK, New Zealand? How generous are we?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I just happened to prepare this slide for you. Look, I think we do very, very well in terms of our support of international aid, and we can philosophise on that. Maybe it's because we're a nation that does travel a lot. We do think about overseas countries perhaps a fair bit more than a number of other groups, and it's interesting to compare us to the US, where undoubtedly philanthropy is wonderful. It's very large, but they give only half the share that we do to international aid. So it has been a very much more insular looking country than we have. So our overall share is very positive at that 12% and it compares well against any countries that we look at. So that's great. My, I guess, warning a little bit for the sector is it's been so reliant on the mass market. And if anyone's followed any of our work on where philanthropy is going in Australia, it's the mass market that is a bit of an issue. The mass market is, the big majority of people giving smaller amounts each year. And what we're finding is a lesser proportion of people are actually donating. The ones who are continuing to donate giving more, but it's that lesser proportion that's the worry for, I think, international aid. And the growing areas of philanthropy are the high net worth market and the corporate sector. And I think they're the areas perhaps that need a little bit of work overall in international aid. And we've got a big report coming out on the corporate sector soon, and people underestimate the size of it. And just linking it into the mass market, one of the drivers for what corporates support is who their employees are interested in supporting. And those employees are the mass market. So in a way, the corporate giving is reflective of the people that are working for them, that mass market that did support international aid. And so I wonder whether a slight shift in how you think about mass market might be worthwhile going out. I think the corporates are reflecting their employees rather than perhaps the employees doing it directly themselves. So overall, good share, but just watch where it's going though.
And John, can you now lead us into a thumbnail sketch of who gets those dollars in the philanthropic space?
Yep, sure. So just Emily, on the next slide there, I've got a chart there that looks at the top 200 charities. So this is just in the order of how much fundraising they do, not the largest charities, because a lot of them get a lot of money from government, but just for fundraising. And of course, international aid is reliant on fundraising as distinct to many other sectors. So international aid gets 70 to 75% of its income from fundraising. Universities, big fundraisers, but it's only 3% of their income. So obviously, and you all know that international aid lives and dies by its fundraising. So when I've plotted that top 200, the red squares there are all international aid organisations. And with all the other causes, it's interesting how dominant international aid is amongst the big fundraisers. And when we look at the numbers that we've got in the words at the bottom of that chart, they've, in that top 200, and remember there are 50,000, 55,000 charities, in that top 200, they get 25% of all of the donations from that top 200. Overall, it's only 12%. So what that says is there's a number of very large international aid charities that get the dominant amount of the money. Overall for the sector, it's the 90-10 rule. 90% of the money goes to the top 10% of organisations. It's far more concentrated in international aid than it is for the broad charity sector.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, John. And thank you for your constant, regular flow of reports to the sector. You are the man that continues to allow us to really measure what is going on within the sector. Now I'm going to turn to Marc Purcell. Mark has been CEO of the Australian Council for International Development since 2009 and is a member of the AIDN Advisory Committee. Mark would be very well known to many of you out there in viewerland. Mark, welcome to the conversation.
Good morning, everybody.
Mark, this is your chance. Tell us about ACFID. Who do you represent? How many members? How many countries are they active in?
Sure. Look, I'll do a bit of a presentation as well, just so for if you miss the figures, people can get it later on. But Emily, if you can show the second slide. So the Australian Council for International Development is a peak body for 130 Australian community organisations working internationally. So we probably only represent about 25% of the total number of charities in Australia working internationally, but 80% of the volume of funds. If you just go to the next slide, thanks, Emily. On the logo, so it's that's it. 80% of the funds raised in Australia go through our member organisations. And those organisations range from big household brands that John was talking about, that are globally federated and work in many, many countries, to very specialised organisations that might only work in one country, and a lot of organisations that just might work in one sector, like teacher training in Cambodia, environmental management in the Pacific. All of them are governed by boards. Those boards have amazing people on them. For example, Good Return, which is a microfinance organisation, has Gordon Cairns, the chair of Woolworths, on it. Caritas has Martin Laverty, the CEO of AMA. There's more chartered accountants than you can poke a stick at. So they're all registered with the Australian Charities Not-for-Profit Commission. Next slide, please. They're supported, as John indicated, by around 1 million Australians regularly donating each year. That forms in our membership about 37% of the income, but importantly for people tuning in, half of our members work in a program with the Australian Government and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and it's actually a match funding program. So for those that are accredited with DFAT, under the Australian NGO Cooperation Program, the dollar donations from the public are leveraged on a very favourable ratio of 1:4. So it sort of maximises. But they have to go, those NGOs have to go through a really rigorous in-house audit around those programs. And then if you go to the next slide, which just shows the footprint, and you can get this detail on our website, www.acfid.asn.au, but you can go into each country and see which Australian NGOs are operating there, and the names of their programs, the level of money that is being spent overall in those countries, and you can do it by region as well. So it's quite a useful tool if you're just trying to get a handle, if you have a particular interest in a particular issue and sector and you want to understand who's doing what where. if you go to the final or the next slide, the other thing that sort of distinguishes those 130 organisations from the many Australian organisations that are doing great work internationally is that for the last quarter of a century, ACFID members have had to meet a standard which has a whole series of commitments that need to be signed off at the board level to demonstrate their organisation is doing transparent fundraising, what their costs are. You can look at all of our members' financials and there will be a standardised approach to transparency on how they're raising money and how they're spending money. It includes public complaint systems. And I think importantly, just in relation to faith-based organisations, so a third of our members are faith-based. Some are linked to major denominational churches, some are, Christian or Muslim in tenor, but for our members, they must separate out their fundraising for development assistance activities from religious activities and clearly distinguish that. So if you donate to one of our members, it'll be clear that you're donating for humanitarian assistance program. You're not donating for, religious proselytization. The other thing is that there is complaints mechanism that members must have that is available to the public, but ACFID acts as a court of appeal, essentially, with its own investigative complaints mechanism, Code of Conduct Committee, which is chaired by Alan Cameron, the former chair of ASIC. Thanks.
Mark, does that complaints committee, as you refer to it, does that get much of an outing? Are there many complaints?
Yeah, so like as always, really, if you've got no complaints, then something's wrong. So often it's a degree of self-policing within the sector around our code of conduct and the standards, which organisations are pretty, they're well across. So, generally a dozen complaints in a year. And obviously our aim is to get a remedy with the organisation. And our experience is most organisations are keen to fix the remedy if the complaint is upheld. It's arm's length from ACFID's board and governance and executive management for obvious reasons, because sometimes you can get agencies that might have a representative on our board and that they are actually subject to investigation. So it's a confidential process. So it's quite sort of nuanced and complex, but it does work and it is effective. From the perspective of the government, the ACNC, which is the National Charities Regulator, recognises our code, and also our code, that set of standards, is a prerequisite for accreditation for that DFAT funding I mentioned.
So is it fair to say that between obviously ACNC that regulates the whole sector, and then for international you have your code of conduct, arguably there's more governance over international giving than even there might be domestically?
Well, look, I think it's a highly regulated sector, and the other thing to say is, there's from the outset of Australians forming organisations after the Second World War to start doing international work, and we're in a region surrounded by developing countries, so Australians have always been engaged in assisting our neighbours. There's been a real focus on effectiveness, because you're making interventions into other people's cultures, jurisdictions. How do you know you're making a difference? It's complex. I think there's a lot of blood, sweat and tears on things that didn't work, that have built up a degree of confidence in what is good practice and what is bad practice. And the good practices captured in our standards. So, for example, poverty is gendered. Women experience poverty more deeply in more diverse ways in all countries and all societies. And so our code requires you to set out, well, how do you deal with that? What's your organisation's approach to that? So it's sort of trying to give a level of confidence and show that you're working to an industry standard around trying to have an effective approach and have greater impact.
So Mark, it's that time of year when we're approaching federal budget time again. No doubt ACFID's been active and has put a submission into the government. Can you tell us what you're asking for?
Yeah, sure. If we just go to the next slide. So under the coalition government, the Australian aid program is set at $4 billion, but we were really pleased 18 months ago. There was a big campaign by Australian NGOs and the health sector in Australia called End COVID for All, which was to try and get the government to respond to COVID. And so COVID has hit developing countries, as our society, really hard. Massive economic impacts with economies shrinking and big health impacts. The government put in what it's called temporary targeted measures, and that's been really welcomed by our sector, but also by our neighbours. But it totals about 1.3 billion over about 2.5 years on top of that 4 billion. If you go to the next slide. So we're essentially calling for the government to make those increases permanent, because the 4 billion figure is really the aid program where John Howard left it in 2007, 15 years ago. And the world has changed so much. So as we've still got the pandemic raging, even though we've taken our masks off. The reality is in many countries, the pandemic is present, and we know that variants of COVID are going to come up and it could strike us all again. So it's in our interest to be resourcing more into global vaccine efforts to vaccinate everybody in the world. We all have an interest in that. Secondly, we're in a much more uncertain environment geostrategically now in our part of the world, with the rise of China, the competition with the US. So we're arguing that the aid program, the government's aid program, is a really essential tool of foreign policy. So what you can see here is the forward estimates, which is how the government does budget. And obviously in an election, Labor has promised in its platform a slight increase of 0.01% each year. But what you've also got here is where we think you need to prioritise. So we need to extend those temporary targeted measures in the gold colour into the out years. We need to increase funding to Afghanistan, which has got a huge humanitarian crisis there with the rise of the Taliban, and obviously now we can add in Ukraine, and then you can see that global vaccine effort. And really, that's a choice for both governments, or both parties. Sorry, that to extend or not extend to resource these big humanitarian crises in the world. So we're hoping that national interest argument, that we've all got an interest in seeing the world vaccinated, will make a difference. But we're also hoping that the next government will continue the good work that's been started with that response to COVID, and actually use the aid program as a major tool of foreign policy to make a more stable, safer and prosperous world.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Mark. We may circle back to you later on. Thank you, ACFID, for representing the sector to the government up there in Canberra, because someone needs to put the voice of the sector forward to them. Now let's change gears, and we'll move from Canberra up to Brisbane. And I want to introduce Eva Milo, who based up in Brisbane and works for, among others, Partners for Equity here in Australia, and the Siegel Family Foundation. Siegel are based out of New Jersey, but very much with numerous staff and operations on the ground in East Africa. Morning, Eve.
Good morning, Mark.
Eve, what are your observations on the level of giving internationally out of Australia? What are your thoughts on why it isn't larger? What do you see as the obstacles?
Yeah, definitely from my perspective, international giving from Australia could be better. It could be increased. And some of the things I've been observing as the obstacles, the first thing, which I think for me is the biggest thing, is trust, that there is less trust to international organizations. I've talked to donors who cite corruption, talk about embezzlement. They're not sure if their funds are going to be used well and appropriately. But that's mostly because they have not familiarized themselves with the work of international organizations and the impact that they are creating. Over the years with my work, Partners for Equity and at Siegel Family Foundation, I've worked with several organizations. And, when we review the cases of why we stopped funding them, Corruption barely is the issue. So, it's things like mission creep. They grew too big for our funding to make a significant impact. So what I'm trying to say here is that if trust is the barrier for you, there are many trustworthy organizations that are doing great work internationally, and that, if you're around the right circles, you can have access to them. So that shouldn't be an issue. But the second gap I also see is a knowledge gap, that many donors don't really know where to find these organizations. And if they find them, how do you engage them? How do you go about doing due diligence? And that's where plugging into networks like AIDN is important. It's not very obvious, of course, where to find these organizations. But if you're around like-minded funders, and plug into networks like AIDN, Philanthropy Australia, then finding these groups becomes easy. You don't have to start from scratch because many donors are willing to share due diligence with you. The other one, of course, is the tax deductibility barriers if you don't have DGR status. We know that Australia's treatment of cross-border donations has major barriers if you don't have DGR status, and it's certainly considered one of the strictest. So that continues to be another barrier that we see in the sector. And then I think the last one I want to touch on is that, when you look at the composition of the staffing of most foundations, it is very lean. They've got about 2 or 3 staff that go around, finding organizations and programs. So they just do not have enough staffing to go out there, to travel, get onto a plane, go see the work. And that in itself is a limitation. But again, if you plug into, for example, Partners for Equity has done lots of due diligence on different organizations, and all those are listed on Partners for Equity website. So that's a place to start if you have a very lean team as you try to build up your internal structures.
Thanks, Eva. And I'll put a brief plug in for our second webinar here, by the way, where we will be talking to a number of the platforms that can give you access to many international NGOs. Eve mentioned Partners for Equity, but there's at least another 7 or 8 such organisations, and we'll certainly be talking more about that as a conduit in the second webinar. Eve, I want to double back to your question on trust. Our family foundation, we did fund one local organisation, locally led organisation, where it didn't end well. The services were delivered. We saw the buildings that funding had gone to, so it wasn't a scam in the sense of disappearing overnight with the cash. But we did find out that the land title was in the name of the founder, not in the name of the NGO. A subsequent audit at the end did show that there was spending that was unaccounted for. Then when we asked some questions, answers were a bit on the evasive side. At the end of the day, it was an issue of trust, and we sadly decided to move on with our funding. What is your response to that?
Oh man, I had such stories, but I think it's good to look at such stories with the broader picture. So my question to start off to you would be, on average, how many international organizations have you funded?
Over the last 15 years or so, there's probably been a couple of hundred in total across the various foundations and various one-off relationships or decade-long relationships.
And of those, how many have you stopped funding because of trust-based issues?
Probably a dozen or so, and it's fair to say out of that dozen or so, probably not many of them have actually been locally led organisations, I suppose. We had one case where the founder of the organisation actually left the country and returned to the USA without telling us. That's always a bit of a body blow to find that out 4 months later. We had another case where a founder resigned, which he's entitled to do and move on to something else in his life, but just did not really leave any time for a smooth transition. I guess it's not a high proportion at the end of the day, and we have never had one where it was a scam, where it's just we do due diligence such that it's not going to be a case of the money went into a suitcase and disappeared overnight.
And you know where I'm going with this, right? So from whatever you've said,
I never know where you're going, Heath.
from what you have shared, you've clearly had more success rates than failures.
Yeah.
And I know that these isolated cases do happen. We see that everywhere.
Mm.
But when you look at them in the grand scheme of things, they are actually very few cases. If you are doing the right thing, you are doing proper due diligence, you are going out there and seeing those organizations, you are trying to build a relationship that is based on trust, transparency, certainly you are going to see few of those cases. We know that there will always be some bad apples here and there, but that's not the case. And of course, we know even from just looking at media blows bad things out of proportion. So it's the same thing here, that if we decided to just focus on the good things, on the impact that we have seen, on the organizations that are delivering, I think I would need a year to share the success stories.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so bad that happened with that trust issue that you had, but it's also very good to hear that you've had way more success stories that for me, I think outweigh the bad apples.
Yeah. Okay. No, you make a good point. You make a good point. So, yeah, and look, perhaps I'll just share here how briefly our philanthropic journey and how we traversed into international. We established our family foundation in 2003 with a focus on education. We then came across the School of St. Jude in Tanzania in 2006. And I'll declare a conflict here. I am involved with St. Jude's on the board there, but St. Jude's really opened my eyes to I guess that cost benefit equation. St. Jude's provides a quality education that gets most graduates into university and the best ones into even Stanford University. Cost per year is, including boarding, is $2,900 to educate a student and to feed them 3 meals a day. I guess we'd all understand that a similar education in Australia could cost up to $35,000 a year. St. Jude's very much provides quality education. You can fund more basic education in Africa or Asia for even around $500 a year. Cataract operations, yes, they are performed overseas for less than $50 each. So when we could see that with our own eyes, it made perfect sense to go down the route of largely supporting international organisations. Then along came Planet Wheeler Foundation, Maureen and Tony Wheeler's foundation, and I guess we became more expansive with our operations and came across that issue of where do we find more groups to fund, how do we establish that trust, and in 2015 then we set up Partners for Equity with our good friends at DAC and helmed by Linda Fox. So look, we now have the luxury, if we put COVID-19 aside, that between the team we can travel 20 to 30 weeks a year and visit the projects, see the progress, and see writ large that bang for buck. Eve, you've been managing a portfolio of smaller African organisations, African-led organisations, I should say. Can you tell us a bit about that and how your success rate's been there?
Oh yeah, very happy to share. So this portfolio of African organizations that I manage was actually, we founded this in 2019 after an article that was published in The Guardian that only 0.4% of funding goes to local organizations. Now, the trustees at Partners for Equity had traveled around Africa, seen different African organizations, African-led organizations, and the impact that they were creating. So when they saw the statistic, it just didn't make sense why more funding was not going to locally led organizations out in Africa. And so that's how we started this portfolio. You know, they committed funding and said, let's see what this funding can do. Let's start off small and see if we invest this money in locally led organizations, how far can we go? What do we see after a year, 2 years, 3 years? And so this portfolio started, I put together initially, it was 10 organizations operating mostly in East Africa and doing different kinds of projects in healthcare, in education, livelihoods, and the like. And I'm happy to report within a year of funding them, we saw the number of beneficiaries that they were supporting more than double. And this is not even a lot of funding, you know, this is an average grant size of 25K, but the impact that that was able to create was significant. And of course, you know that locally led organizations have minimal expenses. They're not traveling back and forth from one country to another. They don't have big budgets in terms of where they're paying expert staff. So when you look at the amount of dollars that actually go to the actual projects, it's almost literally everything. So your money is put to very, very good use. And with these organizations that I've been working with, we get prompt reporting. They all report on the progress of their programs. Of course, sometimes the reports might not be as perfect, and that's where we come in with capacity support, because we know that they might lack in capacity to effectively deliver on some of their work. But capacity takes money. You know, if they're not being funded, how are they going to invest in capacity? And so our approach has not just been grant funding, but also that capacity support, work with you, help you fill the gaps. You know, increasingly these days, more funders are willing to support capacity, but that wasn't the case before. It wasn't considered a sexy area to fund. So how do we get that and, you know, help them, support them deliver on their missions? And so we're seeing so much impact. And also the other thing we've learned is that these organizations are not perfect. You know, they're rough around the edges, but grassroots organizations have not been given that permission to fail or learn from their mistakes. Many times, once they make a mistake, funders pack up and leave, but that's not how it should be. You know, help them through those danger signs, help them highlight where the issues are, where the failures are, how they can learn from that, how they can come back up and deliver. And with that approach, we have seen significant impact. And in fact, I'm happy to report right now that portfolio has grown to 15 organizations. And since we started supporting them in 2019, we have only ceased funding for one organization. It wasn't anything to do with money was embezzled or all of that. No, it had to do with mission creep issues that we had to step away from it. So that's the kind of success that we are seeing.
Eve, can you just explain to me, do you believe in sort of one-off project-based funding just to get something started, or do you think longer-term relationships are necessary?
Definitely longer-term relationships. And the way I look at it is, you know, when you're starting to date someone, are you going in it for just a one-night stand? Sorry to use that. Or do you want it to be a more longer-term relationship? I'm certain if, you know, most of us look for longer-term relationships, and this is the same approach, the same lens that we should apply here, that, you know, you want to get these groups, and that's if you're looking for sustained long-term impact, that we should be looking at an approach where we are in it for the long game, where we know that it is going to take a while to get to the root of these problems, to bring about systemic change that we want to see. It's not just going to be a one-off, but also the approach to it should not be restricted funding. Many times these groups are in very tough communities, and many times issues just happen. They've got to be flexible with the funding. They've got to apply the money according to how they see a need and where they see a need. So if your funding is restricted, then you won't enable them to respond very quickly, respond effectively. And case in point is COVID. You know, when COVID happened, many of these organizations we support were stuck with millions of money because the funder said, we can't touch this money. It specifically has to go to education. But schools are closed, people are dying, you know, people cannot go to their workplaces. You have to take food to people's doorsteps and all of that. So if they can't be flexible with that funding, then we are just stalling this whole development agenda. So flexible funding whenever possible. I think I encourage funders to stay away from tied funding, but also look at the longer term goal and the longer term sustainable impact that you want to see.
Interesting, and I'm glad it wasn't the 59-year-old white male that referred to one night stand on the call. So great. Okay, Eve, well let's drill down a bit. Give us an example of an organisation you've funded. Let's talk about one or two.
Great, happy to single out one, and this is called Food for Education that operates in Kenya, most specifically the Nairobi area. So Food for Education provides nutritious lunches for children in Kenyan public schools to ensure that they stay in school and learn. And of course, the government doesn't provide school lunches, so this is a big gap that they're meeting. It was founded by a lady, very passionate, called Wawira, and Wawira is a graduate from the University of South Australia who returned back to Kenya to serve her community. So we started funding them in 2019, and in just 1 year of supporting Food for Education, they tripled the provision of school lunches from 10,000 to 30,000 kids. In just 1 year, they constructed a second kitchen, and this year, as we speak, they are on track to feed 100 kids per day. And this number might actually
100,000, I think.
100,000, yeah, 100K, yes, 100,000 kids per day. And this number is even likely to double by the end of the year. They've set up more kitchens. They now have about 4 kitchens. And the meals that they're providing, when you look at the impact that they're creating, these meals are keeping students in school. I'm not sure about you, but I can't learn on an empty stomach. So just a simple meal a day that costs just a few cents is keeping kids in school. And, you're looking for impact. This is impact at its best. So that's one of the stories that I can share, and happy to share way more stories.
And you referred to that cost. Eve, I want to say it's around about 18 cents per lunch, isn't it? I think they've got the
18 cents per lunch, yes.
Yeah.
And the parents are even contributing to this because they too see the value of kids actually studying with a meal, not on an empty stomach. These are very poor parents, but they're able to take just a few cents and say, I'll contribute this, and the organization can subsidize that cost.
Which of course adds to the sustainability and the ability to grow of the whole organization.
That's right.
Yeah. Just to our viewers out there, if anyone does want to ask a question, feel free to put something in the chat page as we travel along. Eve, I might ask you about Muso as well, which is not a locally led organisation, but they've been achieving great things.
Oh, certainly. And I even now consider them local because of the approach that they've taken.
Okay.
But Muso is out in Mali, and it was founded by Jessica and Ari. These are young American doctors that came in from San Francisco General Hospital, went into Mali, saw all the gaps that were happening in Mali's healthcare system, and decided that they wanted to create an innovative healthcare model. So they called it Muso, which means woman in the Bambara local language. And they established a clinic in a peri-urban setting of Mali and worked with community health workers. Community health workers would be, lower cadre people who are trained to deliver basic health services. So they worked with them and trained them, set them up in these different communities. And many of them started to go out there doing door-to-door, seeking out ill patients and pregnant mothers rather than waiting for them to come to hospital because many of them wouldn't show up. And these community health workers were referring them to the hospital. So in 2013, they measured the outcomes of what they were seeing. And what they saw was that there was a 90% reduction in under 5 mortality. That is incredible. That is just outstanding. And so they teamed up with the Ministry of Health in Mali to spread this model across the country. And last year, they expanded their operations into Cote d'Ivoire. So today, Muso is employing 500 staff, of which 97% are from Mali and 79% are women. And their community health workers do over 700,000 home visits in a quarter. And this is all with a budget of 20 million for this year. So that's the kind of impact that we see when you start to fund international projects. 90% reduction in under 5 mortality. That is incredible.
I think I could add there as well, Eve, sometimes one could be concerned about the political situation in these countries as well. I recollect that in the time that Muso have been in Mali, there have been 3 or 4 coups d'etats. Government has been disrupted a number of times at a senior level. There was an incursion into the north of the country by Al-Qaeda related operatives maybe 5 or 6 years ago. but this has not effectively altered their operations one bit. As you say, they're integrated into the local communities, and the government, be it yesterday's government or today's government, wants them to keep doing what they're doing, and similarly, the militants have not disrupted what they're doing either. So
that's right.
Yeah, the macroeconomic issues are not always a game changer.
Yeah, and if you have 97% local staff, even if these political conflicts happen, they're going to be there. They are there to stay. This is their community. They have no way out. And I guess that's why it's important that even if, with our approaches internationally, we localize them as much as we can. And that's the difference. That's what, that's why their program is really successful. That, as you said, they're deeply embedded within the local community structures, and they are able to stay even with all kinds of catastrophes happening around them.
So, if someone, if a funder has never given overseas, or if they want to broaden what they're currently doing, can you give us some practical tips? Look, undoubtedly there are our very large NGOs that have very adequate teams that can talk to these people, so they can contact any of them to learn more about what's happening internationally. But yeah, what's your advice if they wanted to go another route?
Yeah, I think my first tip would be start off with funding one group, because you need to familiarize yourself with the space and see how it goes. I wouldn't recommend you come from 0 kilometers per hour to 100. No, start off with 10, 20 kilometers and build it up gradually. So start with a few groups or 1 or 2 groups, and try to visit them, try to be so embedded into what they're doing. And of course, with that, take an unrestricted funding approach that gives them the flexibility to allocate funds as they see fit. And then, when you review what your funding did, have grantees explain the importance of untied giving, instances of where they went to a donor for emergency funding, or how they allocated those funds in a way that you didn't even expect. You'll be quite amazed at the stories. And what that does is it helps cultivate that trust-based relationship. It helps you build and see what exactly they're doing, and the fact that they actually know exactly what is good for them, and they know how to allocate these funds appropriately. The other thing, of course, yes, consider a field trip. And I would maybe strongly suggest that you reach out to other funders that have been on an international field trip before, many again of whom you can find in the AIDN network, Philanthropy Australia. Go with them for that very first visit. Explore, just watch and observe how they ask questions, because there's a reason we ask certain questions to certain groups. When I go out into the field, for example, an organization whose budget is 200K, I'm not going to ask them the same questions as an organization whose budget is $1 million or plus. There are certain things, you're looking for. There is a way you engage with the communities. So I'd recommend finding somebody to go with you on that first trip. But also, again, I go back to the issue of trust, that if you have not given before, your approach should be, again, from a trust-based perspective. Trust organizations to allocate funding as they see fit. Take a bottom-up approach. Sometimes, we see that funders think, oh, I know what they should be doing with my money. Oh, no, you're sitting in Australia, you're not in the field. They know better. They are from those communities, or they've been working there for a much longer time, and they know exactly what the issues are. So I think you have to take that approach that is a bottom-up approach. And if you take that extreme approach where you're going to audit the pencils and all these things, there are going to be reservations in the way these organizations relate with you. So you want to give them that breathing space, trust them, cultivate openness and transparency, and you'll see the impact that you're looking to see. And I think I'll just throw this in, that we also as funders have to shift our narrative from whether to how. You have to move on from questioning whether you should fund internationally to how you can fund international organizations. Currently the stats are about 300 million people around the world require humanitarian assistance. When you hear such numbers, I really think there should be a shift from, oh, okay, you should stop pondering on whether you should be funding internationally and just do it. The need is there. The impact for your dollar is going to be realized.
Great, thank you, Eve. Thank you very much. That's quite inspiring. I'm now going to circle back to Marc Purcell. Mark, with all of your members, you must see some great NGOs, some great things happening out there. Do you want to share just one example of? You're probably in trouble with all your other members, but anyway.
I am going to be in trouble with all my members. I know a couple of them are on the call, and if Emily could just show the final couple of slides, please. But just to sort of build on what Eve said, like, I think some forms of we call it development assistance rather than aid. So governments do aid, but we say development assistance because development is about working with communities in long-term partnerships to ensure sustainability. So actually you're working with those communities, wherever they may be, to help them find the solutions to the issues that they're facing. And that makes it more sustainable. And so most NGOs will have an exit strategy after 10 years or so working with particular communities and partners. The second thing I wanted to say is some forms of assistance lend itself well to metrics, like you're distributing bed nets like Gates do to stop malaria. And you can measure, how many bed nets you've distributed. Others, if you're working in the Highlands PNG, where you might be working on violence against women, it's going to be more complex. It's not simple, dollar in and you get a sort of an immediate a sort of result. You're in there for the long haul. Because it was International Women's Day yesterday, happy International Women's Day, I did want to pick one program from one of our members, noting that many of our members do work with women, many of our members do work on microfinance, but International Women's Development Agency is a Melbourne-based agency, and their partner, West Ara Rokatani Kini Association, is in the Solomon Islands, and it's, they do work on financial inclusion and micro enterprise loans, as you can see there. But if you go to the next slide, they do more. They're also working on really building empowerment of those women in those savings groups. So a real focus on gender equality. And they're also, then you can see that they're sort of directing some of their investments into not just livelihoods, but also, sustainable energy. In a lot of these countries or regions in countries where Australian organisations, community organisations, our members are working, they don't have electricity. So things like solar are actually really, really pertinent there. So I'm just highlighting that one as many, but as I said, if you go to our aid map, which I've posted in the chat, you can see which of the Australian community organisations working in internationally in ACFID's membership of those 130 organisations, where they are, what they're doing, and get a sense for it, and be confident that they're working in long-term partnerships with particular communities, and also they're meeting a standard that is rigorous around trust and accountability. Thanks.
And Mark, one last question. Why would anyone viewing this webinar today or in the future, why should they start giving overseas now?
I think we're incredibly blessed. We are, I feel grateful to be born in Australia, and I think it's a stroke of luck that I was born in this country. I think it's a privilege to be able to not only work and give something to causes in Australia, but it's not an either or. We should also be thinking about our world, because we live in an interconnected world. So many of the problems that we're facing now are the same ones in Australia as in other countries. So COVID being one, and I mentioned that, if we don't get on top of COVID in developing countries and vaccinate everyone, it's going to swirl around and come back to us in new, more virulent forms. So we have a strong driver to do that. Climate change is another one. We're all affected by the climate. So I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time and help our brothers and sisters in many parts of the world, Ukraine, refugees in Afghanistan, Ukraine now, and do long-term work like Eve's been talking about, or the IWDA project, and contribute that way too. And it doesn't mean that we can't do good things in Australia at the same time. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. One question in the chat function. How have you been able to, or has COVID prevented you from visiting local organisations? How have you cultivated trust with new partners from Australia? And how do you conduct your due diligence checks?
Oh, yeah. So COVID definitely has been an issue. But for me, of course, the trust already exists. I've worked with many organizations in the past, so I know many of them are familiar. But specifically for new groups, we do have calls with them. We'll have calls with them who will trust what they say, because that's how you're going to build trust. You've got to trust organizations, that you have to take their word for it. And we've got, our due diligence is quite thorough as well. We will have several calls where, they just walk us through the program of what they're doing. And we don't just hear from one person in the organization. You want to hear from several people, several voices, and put all that together and see if it adds up. But also, many of them do send us reports, and most of them still do have reports. They send us reports. Some of them have gone to the step of doing virtual site visits. So they're able to share videos where we can see what exactly is happening in the field. And they do share audited financials. So with all of that, we are able to make a decision and say, I don't have to visit. I trust you. I trust what you're saying, and I'll give you the money. But I'm glad the borders have opened. I'm getting onto a flight still to see these groups, not because I don't trust them, but because I just enjoy going out there and seeing their work, seeing the impact for myself. So I'll be on a plane soon, visiting organizations and doing what I love. Yeah.
And to be fair, to visit your mum as well, Eve.
Of course, she's part of my groups, quote unquote.
I'm not one of the groups you fund, I hope. Look, our hour has expired, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much to our guests and panelists, to John McLeod, Marc Purcell, and Eva Milo, professionals one and all. Thanks to Jack for his introduction, and to Philanthropy Australia for their support in this endeavour. The recording will be available on AIDN's website and Philanthropy Australia's Better Giving Hub as well. We will also make slides available. Have you registered for part 2 and 3? This is just the beginning of the conversation. In the next 2 webinars, we'll be drilling down into international giving with a range of experts, also showcasing just some of the candidates that you can fund. Part 2 is at 11 a.m. on March the 23rd. Australia will go silent at that moment as everyone tunes in. And our guest list is helmed that day by Peter Singer. If you want to know more about international giving, you can already contact any of our larger NGOs who are well equipped to tell you what they're doing, and who have many, many impactful programs out there in the field. There are countless smaller NGOs managed out of Australia here as well, making a huge difference overseas that you can contact. Then there are the NGOs who do not have representation in Australia. Eve referred to a number of them, and they are easily contactable via their funders based here in Australia. You can always contact AIDN. We'll aim to share with you details of the lesser known players in the sector, so that you can be well skilled to make your next move into international philanthropy. AIDN never sleeps. Tomorrow is a release of the next in our series of podcasts on Philanthropod. Otherwise, email us if you've got feedback or comments on today's presentation or anything else, or if you'd like to discuss international giving. You can contact me, Emily Umbers, or Julie Rosenberg. So make the most of the rest of your day. What you do today is important because you're exchanging a day of your life for it. Thank you very much, everyone.